Welcome back now with the news in detail. Russia has called for the resumption of peace talks between the Taliban and the US. A foreign ministry spokesperson says a visiting Taliban delegation has repeated its willingness to continue dialogue. The Taliban representatives arrived in Moscow yesterday, days after US President Donald Trump said Afghan peace talks are dead. They met the Russian President's special envoy for Afghanistan, Zamir Kabulov. Taliban spokesperson Suhail Shaheen says recent developments in the Afghan peace process were discussed in the meeting. Now, members of the US Congress have reiterated their criticism of India's government for imposing a complete lockdown in occupied Kashmir. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib has condemned India's revocation of occupied Kashmir's special status. In a statement, she also slammed the communications blackout India has imposed and its suppression of life-saving medical care. Tlaib demanded that India end its widespread violence, torture and other human rights violations against Kashmiris. She urged New Delhi to accept responsibility for the violations and hold involved officials accountable. Meanwhile, a group of 7 congressmen have urged the US ambassadors to India and Pakistan to play their role in easing tensions. In a letter, they asked the envoys to work for the restoration of communications and media access to Indian-occupied Kashmir. The congressmen strongly urged the Indian government to release thousands of arbitrarily detained Kashmiris. Members of the European Union Parliament have called for trade and travel sanctions on India over the alarming human rights situation in occupied Kashmir. Richard Corbett, co-chair of Friends of Kashmir Group, called for utilizing all possible means to pressurize India to lift curfew in the valley. Addressing a conference organized in the European Parliament, Corbett proposed the imposition of trade sanctions on New Delhi. He also said travel restrictions for those involved in acts of terrorism in Indian-occupied Kashmir should be imposed. Earlier, the EU members had a chance to meet the victims of unprovoked attacks from India on the line of control. Azad Jammu and Kashmir President Sardar Masood Khan was also present in the conference. Masood Khan welcomed the decision of the European Parliament to hold a debate on the situation in occupied Kashmir. He said the decisions reflected growing concern in Europe over the deteriorating human rights situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir. He also warned about prolonged siege in Kashmir that might end up turning into genocide. Meanwhile, Israeli forces have shot and wounded 58 Palestinians during weekly protests along the Gaza border. Palestinian officials said 3 of the protesters sustained serious wounds. The Gaza-based officials said 31 of the demonstrators were hit by live ammunition. They said another 27 were injured by rubber-coated rounds. Dozens of other Palestinian protesters fell ill after inhaling tear gas fired by Israeli troops. Israeli forces have killed over 300 Palestinians and wounded about 18,000 others since weekly protests began in March 2018. Moving on, 5 major European nations have expressed deep concern about Israel's plans to annex parts of the occupied West Bank. In a joint statement, France, Germany, Italy, Spain and the United Kingdom said the annexation will be a serious breach of international law. The European Union nations call on both sides to refrain from actions which would put two-state solution for Palestine and Israel in jeopardy. Earlier, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he will impose Israeli sovereignty on the Jordan Valley and northern Dead Sea if he is re-elected. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation has called an emergency meeting over Netanyahu's plan. Now, 3 major European nations have urged Iran to return to compliance with the 2015 nuclear accord. France, Britain and Germany have called on Iran to cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency. The EU members have expressed deep concern over the IAEA's report that advanced centrifuges have been installed at Natanz. These countries say they support the nuclear deal and urge Iran to stick to the agreement. Last week, IAEA Chief Colonel Ferrota visited Tehran to check Iran's nuclear programs. The nuclear watchdog said the installation of advanced centrifuges to produce enriched uranium will lead to increased production. Turkey's President Tayyip Erdogan says he will discuss purchasing Patriot missiles from the US with President Donald Trump. In an interview, Erdogan said his personal bond with Trump can avert potential US sanctions over Turkey's buying the Russian S-400 air defense system. He said it is not rational for the US to hurt longtime ally Turkey with sanctions. Talking about Syrian refugee crisis, Erdogan warned Turkey would allow refugees to cross into Europe if it does not get more financial assistance. He said Turkey has spent $40 billion to cope with people fleeing the Syrian civil war. Meanwhile, the US has imposed sanctions on 3 North Korean groups allegedly involved in hacking international bank accounts. A US official says the hacking groups are perpetrating cyber attacks to support illicit weapon and missile programs. The Treasury Department says the group are controlled by North Korea's Intelligence Bureau. The action blocks any US-related assets of the groups and prohibits dealings with them. Earlier, Pyongyang denied UN allegations regarding obtaining $2 billion through cyber attacks on banks and cryptocurrency exchanges. Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he is optimistic about striking a Brexit deal ahead of his talks with European Union chiefs next week. He is due to meet European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker and EU's chief Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier on Monday. Speaking at a conference in Yorkshire, the Prime Minister said his government is working hard to get a deal. The Prime Minister said British people want to leave the EU and that he will not take the UK out of the bloc on 31st October.
So whatever the shenanigans that may be going on at Westminster, we will get on with delivering our agenda and preparing to take this country out of the EU on October the 31st. And there will be ample time for Parliament to consider the deal.
Moving on, Russia says it is ready for talks with Ukraine but has 3 preconditions before it agrees to attend the summit. A senior Kremlin aide says no date has been fixed for the summit of the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, France and Germany. In the first condition, the Russian president's aide says that rival armed forces in eastern Ukraine should be separated across the line of contact. Russia also wants agreed wording on special status for the Donbass region and a preliminary agreement on the summit's conclusions. Earlier, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said sanctions on Russia must remain in place until peace is restored. Drone attacks have been launched on 2 oil facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia, sparking fires. The Interior Ministry says the blazes at 2 Saudi Aramco units in Abqaiq and Khurais provinces have been brought under control. The 2 eastern provinces contain the world's 2 largest oil processing plants. In a statement, the Saudi Interior Minister says an investigation has been launched into the incident. So far, nobody has claimed responsibility for the attacks. In Libya, 3 Eastern Forces members have been killed in a drone strike on a town southeast of Tripoli. Libya's government say the drone targeted a command vehicle in the rebel stronghold of Tarhuna. Eastern Forces commanded by Khalifa Haftar have been engaged in an offensive to seize Tripoli since April. In Algeria, thousands of people have taken to the streets for the 30th consecutive weekend in the capital, Algiers. Protesters have demanded removal of former President Abdul Aziz Bouteflika's allies before a new election. They also called for the release of opposition leader Karim Tabou. Tabou was arrested and accused of weakening army morale. The North African nation descended into political uncertainty after the overthrow of former President Bouteflika in April. Algeria's Constitutional Council scheduled presidential elections for 4th July, but later scrapped them. The UN has warned that 2 million people in Somalia are at a risk of starving. The country is currently facing its worst drought since 2011. The United Nations Relief Chief Mark Lowcock says decades of conflict and a lack of investment has exacerbated the crisis. Speaking at the end of a two-day visit, Lowcock said droughts have become more frequent. He said erratic rains have triggered recurring floods in the country. Moving on, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has called a joint sitting of Parliament to discuss rising gender-based violence. In a letter to parliamentary leaders, Ramaphosa called for measures to protect women and girls against abuse and violence. National Assembly Speaker Thandi Modise has scheduled a special session for September 18th. Gender violence in South Africa has been brought to the fore by the rape and murder of a 19-year-old student earlier this month. Thousands of people marched on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange yesterday to call for listed companies to do more to end gender-based violence.
Most incidences of gender-based violence that happen in the workplace come from the private sector, and it remains silent because they don't do anything about it. They don't have the necessary policies within their environment in order to deal with those things. So we want them to do better and not be silent. Like, wearing black and having a moment of silence is not enough.
The World Health Organization says about 3,000 women in South Africa were murdered in 2018, more than 5 times higher than the global average. Now moving on, the United States and Brazil have pledged a $100 million for a biodiversity conservation fund for the Amazon rainforest. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the fund in a joint news conference with Brazil's Foreign Minister Ernesto Araújo in Washington. Araújo rejected claims Brazil is unable to cope with the environmental challenges to the Amazon. He said the only way to protect the rainforest is to create new jobs for the Amazon's people. Pompeo says the fund will be invested for Amazon biodiversity conservation and the private sector will lead the project.
Grow our trade relationship that already accounts for more than $100 billion annually. And this month, the Brazilians and the American teams will follow through on our commitment that our presidents made in March. We're getting off the ground a $100 million 11-year impact investment fund for Amazon biodiversity conservation, and that project will be led by the private sector.
The highest number of forest fires since 2010 are tearing through the Amazon, which is home to 1 million people. Now staying with Brazil, a fire at a hospital killed 11 people in Rio de Janeiro. The city's fire service says 90 patients were transferred to other hospitals. 4 firefighters were injured while trying to douse the fire, while hospital authorities pointed to a short circuit as a probable cause of the fire. Rio's Mayor Marcelo Crivella said he could not rule out sabotage. The death toll in eastern Spain during flash floods has risen to 5. Severe weather warnings were issued after torrential rains burst riverbanks and swept away cars. Rescue workers have evacuated 3,500 people from the flood-affected regions. Torrential rains have caused chaos, with 2 airports in Murcia and Almeria closing down. More in this report.
Stranded passengers at the hallway of Alicante Airport wait on the floor. Some have decided to sleep as they wait for better weather before heading out to their accommodation. Local authorities have cautioned people to stay indoors in the worst affected areas.
They wait in the queue here 4 or 5 hours. So it's very difficult to get to the toilet, impossible to get anything to eat. I'm also diabetic. I have insulin in my bag. In about 1 hour's time, I'm going to have to take injections or eat one or other, and I don't think it's possible to eat or drink.
Travellers say most airport taxis are not operating, and those that are have become expensive.
It's just unbelievable. Standing here for many hours. I've been traveling now for 24 hours from Iceland to here, and standing here at the airport for many hours waiting for a car.
The National Weather Service says the regions of Valencia, Alicante and Murcia will be hit by similar storms today.
A new storm has brought rain and winds to the battered Bahamas, still reeling from the Category 5 Hurricane Durian. The National Hurricane Center says it could become a tropical storm. It says the weather system is likely to pick up speed as it moves northwest, probably hitting Florida later today. But the tropical cyclone is not expected to bring the same levels of devastation as Hurricane Durian. With 1,300 people still missing, the Bahamian government is focusing on search and rescue operations. On his arrival in the Nassau, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres pledged aid and assistance to the hurricane victims.
But in relation to islands of the Caribbean, one thing is clear. Climate change is already here. It's not a threat to the future. It's happening. And it's happening with devastating impacts. And so it is absolutely essential to have a very relevant investment in resilience and adaptation.
Meanwhile, scientists are warning the biggest glacier in the Swiss Alps could melt away by the end of the century if global warming continues. Cutting-edge simulation technology shows how the mighty Aletsch Glacier will change the planet as temperatures rise. The glacier weighs in at 11 billion tons and covers 86 square kilometers of the Swiss Alps. Its tongue has already retreated by a kilometer since the turn of the century. Scientists predict the trend will continue even if the world can meet the 2015 Paris Agreement. In August Island paid tribute to the vanished Oxjocoal ice sheet to bring the climate calamity to the world's attention. Climate exchange group Extinction Rebellion have announced mass demonstrations in London from the 7th of October. The group says it will shut down major roads near Britain's Parliament in Westminster. It said it will shut down London to force the government to act now on the climate and ecological emergency. Earlier, police arrested two of the group's activists at Heathrow Airport. Airport authorities say they attempted to bring the airport to its standstill by flying drones nearby. Protesters have taken to the hills to form a flashlight carrying human chains to celebrate Mid-Autumn Festival in Hong Kong. Police scuffled with protesters, making a number of arrests. The protests began in June against an anti-extradition bill. They quickly turned into a broader call for a democratic reform. Earlier, hundreds of pro-China demonstrators packed a shopping mall, singing the Chinese national anthem. Meanwhile, the region's chief executive, Carrie Lam, says housing and people's livelihoods are government priorities. She says the government will increase housing facilities. U.S. internet giant Google has agreed to pay $1 billion settlement to end a tax dispute with France. The payment comprises a fine of $503 million plus additional taxes of $514 million. The fiscal fraud probe that began 4 years ago investigated Google's non-payment of dues to France. Investigators claim the tech giant avoided tax by not declaring parts of its activities. The payment follows similar out-of-court settlements by Google in Italy and Britain over recent years. Google says it now wants to see a coordinated reform for a clear international taxation framework. French Justice Minister Nicole Belloubet and Budget Minister Gerald Darmanin have welcomed the arrangement. Now let's have a look at the weather updates. With the weather update, we come to the end of this bulletin. For more news and updates, keep watching Indus News.